Hi, everyone. Let's wait just a couple more minutes for others to join and we'll kick things off. All right, why don't we get things rolling? Thanks everyone for joining today's meeting for Thursday, September 18th, 2025. This is the Inference extension, or also known as Inference Gateway, I guess, community meeting. My name is Damian Hanson, one of the maintainers of the project. The project and this meeting is governed under CNCF guidelines, and what that boils down to is be kind to one another during the meeting and all of our interactions, and I think we've been doing a great job of that, so thank you very much. And with that said, let me go ahead and share my desktop and we'll kind of get into today's agenda. One second here. All right, let me know if you can't see my desktop, but we've got the agenda for today. And as usual, we'll just do a quick review if we have any AIs from last week. Let me go down here. Don't see any AIs. So we will go to the next topic. Next topic is the multi-cluster inference pooling proposal. If you'd like to click on that link as well, I will pull it up here in 1 second. This is a proposal that's been discussed for quite some time in various formats. Rob, thanks for kicking things off with the Google Doc. And then Becca moved that over to this pull request. And we've had tons of discussion around this and so forth. And what we're hoping is that we kind of close the gap and get to a point where we feel comfortable enough with kind of putting a bow on it and trying to move it across the finish line here in the very, very near future. So with that said, there are a few kind of subtopics for this proposal. The first being the proposal does state namespace name sameness for inference pools that will be exported across the member clusters. I don't think there's any contention there at all, but I believe it's Keith who called out the potential need for the EPP that's refed by the exported inference pool if we need to have namespace name sameness across the clusters. Keith, are you on?
Yep, I'm here.
Cool. Let me pause really quick because Rob, I do see your hand up, so I want to give you a chance to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, it just related to that. I mean, I just Keith or anyone on SDO side who's familiar with implementation details there. Why? So my concern here is just it feels like it becomes another point of friction for users if we require namespace sameness here. Obviously, we need some level of namespace name sameness for the pool, but trying to dig into like how would an Istio implementation work here, I guess.
Great
Um,
question. So the friction for Istio, and to be clear, I'm speaking for why we would enforce namespace sameness on the endpoint picker. Different implementations do this differently. But for Istio specifically, the issue boils down to when do we need to make the cluster decision?
mhm,
So with namespace sameness on the inference pool import, or with namespace sameness only on inference pool import, that means that you could have a situation where a particular instance of an inference pool has the same name as other inference pools in the cluster set, but the endpoint picker name is different than the cluster set, than the other inference pools in the cluster set. And so what that means for us, and I'll also just remind folks that the first step after the routing, the L7 routing, so you know what inference pool name you're going to. The first step after that is to go to an endpoint picker. Um, if you don't have namespace sameness on the endpoint picker name, then that means for Istio, we have to, yeah, well, not even just for Istio, in general, you must choose a cluster to go to first. That's the very
mhm.
first step you have to make. And for Istio, the way our routing works, we don't have like a concept of a Kubernetes cluster domain. Like we don't route to a cluster first. The endpoints are sort of routed in one big bag. And then you can create policies based on like your name, or sorry, based on your zone, your subzone, like on your topology. But cluster name, at least in Envoy historically, is not a thing that we've done in Istio. Generally because under sort of MCS logic, you want to be able to see the fleet of clusters as being interchangeable. Um, but again, if you don't have namespace names on the endpoint picker, you have to choose a cluster first. So then you can know what the endpoint picker name is on that inference pool import before you can know which input picker to send to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, there's at least two different models that I'm thinking of here, and my mental models may be completely off. But there's one model where your endpoint selection is like everything's it's Istio, so Envoy based, so everything's in the same uh, cluster set of endpoints, whatever. Like not Kubernetes cluster, Envoy cluster,
Right, right,
um, and and then you're basically just relying on Envoy to make the best pick based off the metrics it has. But it's all grouped together. Is my But then there's this other world where you have like some kind of traffic splitting, right? You have different
hmm
clusters in Envoy, and this is like you have uh, you know, a Envoy cluster or set of endpoints for Kubernetes cluster A and Kubernetes cluster B and Kubernetes cluster C, and you're doing some level of traffic splitting based off of metrics you've received async. And so like the control plane is the one that's saying, hey, right now I see that this Kubernetes cluster has more capacity. And so I'm going to send 60% of incoming requests to, this endpoint picker in that cluster. And in that second model, which is probably an awful model, but in that second model, it seems like you really don't need namespace name sameness because you're doing some form of like the way you get metrics is async out of band. Control plane then adjusts weighting and etc. But if I understand the path you're taking with Istio, or that you think you'd take with Istio, is everything would be in the same group of endpoints here for endpoint picker, regardless of which Kubernetes cluster they relied on, they lived in.
right. That's how Istio is, to my knowledge, always worked. Right. We don't have separate Envoy clusters per Kubernetes cluster. A Kubernetes cluster is effectively an implementation detail. And we don't have APIs for users to say route to this cluster versus that cluster. The only thing we sort of have is like network or topology. And so that's the challenge
Okay.
for us without having, if we don't have namespace sameness on the endpoint picker, then you know we have to sort of consider routing them all just with our existing routing model.
Okay. So that would be entirely dependent on the Envoy making good decisions based on the metric. I mean, you're not going to be able to configure Envoy to scrape the metrics. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how, like, what signal will you have to decide which endpoint picker? Because like it could be very confusing in the sense that if you did least loaded or something like that, the least loaded endpoint picker is not necessarily the least loaded like set of endpoints behind the endpoint picker.
So yeah, there's only, I think generally there's only so much that we're going to be able to do without a global endpoint picker. So I'm assuming that the endpoint picker is completely local here. Um, I mean, in theory, Istio could change its routing model and sort of create a Envoy cluster per Kubernetes cluster and sort of have cluster be a larger part in the, I shouldn't say routing, in the load balancing decision. Um, it's just not something that we've done. And so it's a lot simpler for us to sort of make the requirement that the input pick has to be namespace sameness. You make a good point that like the only thing that we can, we've got this problem with ambient and the ambient multi-cluster because it's a similar problem when you've got sort of this intermediate thing in between the destination for where your endpoints actually live. And um uh, yeah, you just sort of have to, I think, be okay with um non-optimal routing eventually. Like maybe we do something with Orca and have Envoy, endpoint picker send data point information to Envoy about its endpoints. Maybe the control plane that's talking to all the different clusters gets data from the endpoint picker to dynamically weight based on control plane config. I don't know, but given Istio's current routing model, that's where that logic would have to live because we just don't have, we've never routed based on where the cluster is.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Orca seems like an interesting solution
I'm
here.
just throwing something out there
No,
as
no, no, no,
somebody
no.
in that space. It's just
Yeah. It's good. It's good to think that through. Yeah. Sorry, Kellen. I've been ignoring you. Yeah.
No, it's okay. I'm coming from a place of ignorance with regards to Istio, so just making that clear before I ask any questions. But this namespace, you suggested the EPP should have the same name. Is that what I heard, or did I mishear that?
yeah. So for a given inference pool, or I'll say it like this: that the inference pools, so that the input pickers referenced by a set of inference pools across clusters should all have the same name.
How can we guarantee that since we usually use a deployment? I guess you're suggesting we should use pods then so we can control the name?
No, it's the service name.
It's the
endpoint
service
picker
name of the
service.
input picker.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry,
it's a service identity that needs sort of namespace sameness.
Right. So Kellen, for every inference pool that's exported, that inference pool needs to have the same EPP service namespace and name across each exported cluster.
Okay.
Right. And I'm candidly still like a little gray on why it's needed for Istio. And Pete, maybe you could give us a hand on kind of creating a a doc and elaborating in, and I'd really kind of want to pull John in to get his input as well. And I just, you know, question, I mean, is there any way to kind of move forward without at least trying without the EPP namespace name, the EPP namespace name sameness?
Oh,
So
I think
that,
they're definitely, to be clear, I don't think that Istio needs the Inference extension to require input picker namespace sameness. Like we can just require that for our users. I think that's totally valid. The only thing I'd say for the Inference extension is that it's usually a lot more difficult to add requirements versus taking them away. Um, it's less of a concern maybe since multi-cluster is starting off and being very new, so you've got a lot of time for feedback and things like that. But I think we can certainly do the proposal forward, just with the caveat that Istio will have an additional requirement due to just how our routing model works and it not being explicitly cluster aware. We definitely should talk to John. I was thinking about this side by side. I think our conclusion was that there is no way to make this work for like all of our models, like multi-network with the multi-network model Istio has with the east-west gateway. Imaging traffic has its own problem because of double L7 processing on both the source gateway and the destination gateway, both having to do sort of HTTP. So my goal here is to just try to find one configuration that works for our users in open source, and sort of just as long as that exists, I can be happy.
Cool. My only real input is just, yeah, I would like to avoid a global EPP because it kind of takes on a different set of responsibilities, and so it would be less an EPP and more just a new thing.
Yeah, plus one. I think that, because we have such a tight a reliance on a tight connection between each individual pod or endpoint, and the EPP, and kind of just the way the EPP is designed, I don't think it's designed to scale to massive numbers of endpoints. I think finding a way to distribute them is definitely, and lean on a layer above, like this kind of multi-cluster example would be ideal.
okay. So I think we've got a path forward for this issue. And again, Keith, if you want to kind of create a separate Google Doc and link it into the proposal PR so we don't lose track of that. And my thinking is if we can get, other use implementations that, have similar requirements, to your point, we could later add that as a requirement to the proposal. And go from there. Because I mean, I think all of us we're going to learn a lot as we go through the implementation for this. So I do expect this to evolve, and my thinking is, start off as simple as possible and iterate.
Yeah, I'm guessing I'm curious to hear from if anybody from like Envoy Gateway or other like implementations can chime in. Like, are you all taking cluster into account for routing?
So I could speak from a K gateway standpoint. I mean, the plan, I mean, right now it's just a high level plan, but yeah, we're going to take clusters into account, resolve the necessary information from the clusters, routes based on that information. And the next step after kind of finalizing this is within the K Gateway repo, I'll be creating, a similar enhancement proposal. So I'm happy to kind of share that back with this community as that moves forward. So I expect that to be started next week. So probably really nothing to share with the community for maybe a week or two, but could definitely do that.
John just pointed me to something that I'm going to follow up on this actually. Apparently there's an annotation or there's a setting in Istio that you can use to take cluster into account. So we might have some of the bones for this already, and you could just maybe plug it in for this use case. It's not typical, but I think you could. So I'll get back to you folks on this.
Cool. Yeah, and if you could do me a favor, yeah, ping us in the chat, and I'd like to maybe also update this note just in case anyone does come back here. But all right, so I think we're headed in the right direction with this sub topic. The next subtopic, and I see Ryan, you're on the call, so I appreciate you bringing this up as a concern. Right. So currently, the way the proposal is defined is that since inference pool import is a controller managed resource, the thought was, okay, just use status. But the issue we have there is if we're going to surface status conditions that contain observed generation, observed generation is essentially useless without spec. So wanted to bring this up. Where should we? I think status conditions are important to have. So that essentially tells me that we should probably have the controller define the list of clusters in spec, and just document that the API is meant to be controller managed. But Ryan, I see your hands up if you want to go ahead and chime in.
Thanks. Just actually before that, sorry, I just looked at the proposal. The current Go structure doesn't have pretty much anything other than the cluster name. Comparing with the first version, which has a lot of information like EV. Is that what we are doing now? Just the name alone?
Yeah. So generally start off super simple, and instead of instead of the API stating or dictating, right, what what needs to be represented, and we're saying, hey, it's implementation specific, right? So here's a cluster, the list of exported clusters. It's your responsibility as an implementation to glean or gain the information of that cluster necessary to route to that particular exported inference pool.
Okay.
Rob, I see your hand. I'm sorry, Ryan, were you going to say something?
This is just the first thing. That then in this, because it matters, because if the status, then that means the name is pretty much the most important information in that cluster inference pool import, right? Because that's basically the whole thing you need to know. Then if this is in the spec, what does that mean? That means the controller you have this one called import controller, right? What do you call it? It's called what do you call it?
Right. So if it's in spec, then it's basically saying it's the multi-cluster controller that is responsible for taking the exported inference pool, creating an inference pool import, and defining the clusters in spec, managing that list of clusters in spec, which again, like, seems weird in the sense that that should be, in my opinion, user facing. But again, if we say, okay, no spec, it should just be status, then we lose observed generation. And so do we then say, okay, we don't need status conditions? I think that would be the other topic, right? If we don't want to define a list of clusters in spec, then in my opinion, then we should really consider whether we even have status conditions.
Yeah, let me think through this a little bit. It's
Okay.
It's weird. Yeah.
Yeah. Rob, your hands up too.
Yeah, I mean, I think having anything in spec, not to jump too far ahead here, but I think it's pretty hard to disconnect that from the multiple implementations bit, because if you have multiple implementations, then you each could have a different set of connected clusters that, if you imagine a mesh and say a cloud provider that both have their own concepts of which clusters are connected, then whatever, I guess spec could also be nested, but then that feels even more like it's just status and not, which just keeps on leading me to the idea that this is all just status. And maybe we just leave spec out. Maybe that's weird. I don't know. I'm trying to think of. I mean, basically, the only other resource I can think of like this is service import. But if there are others, would be useful to think
And just
get through.
Just to add that for the service MCS service import, we had probably had a debate on whether it should be status or state or not every 6 months, and it's been 4 years. We still haven't figured that out.
I'm trying to remember. Service import, most of the content is in status, or did I?
In the spec, it's
Oh,
weird. It has the IPs in the spec, clusters in the status. It's the current state, but everybody agrees it's
man.
weird. Then, but nobody can agree what exactly it should be. So we had all put in the status. We all agree that put IP in the spec is weird. So
Yeah.
especially with the status, with the cluster list in the status. So we kind of agree that this is not good, but we cannot agree on whether it should just be a status or even had one at a certain point we thought it'd just be a data object, no spec, no status. It's like a service endpoint slice, things like that. Just a data point. Yeah, we had multiple discussions. It's just a weird thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that is very strange. Okay. Yeah. So I'm looking at it. Yeah, we've got ports, IP, type, session affinity in spec, and then clusters and status. So I guess we agree clusters belong in stat. Well, maybe we don't agree. I don't know. I guess that would be the one very strange thing if we clusters were the only thing in status and service import and the only thing in spec in inference pool import. That would really throw people for a loop. So maybe we copy. Man.
No, definitely
What a
don't
mess.
copy what we have copy what we are proposing. I mean, we have V1 Alpha 2 discussion for like 2 years already. Just trying to fix that. But yeah. One more thing, if I may, is the KEP's GEP, I guess. There's export controller. This kind of still for me is kind of implementation detail, because that the current spelling looks like this controller will need to watch every inference pool on every clusters, and then also put the inference pool import to all the cluster that has that namespace. That becomes kind of like a Uber controller that knows everything. I'm not sure if this is the only way to implement this. And also, I mentioned in the previous comments, it's kind of have a security issue, because you kind of have a God mode controller reads everything, knows everything. Whoever gets compromised, this one basically controls the entire fleet, not just a cluster. Yeah, that's the.
I think that's a.
The multi
also,
just one thing to add, the multi-cluster SIG, we are actively trying to move everything. By the way, this is kind of the default open source mode, right? Argo CD, multi-queue is still, they all doing it exactly the same like this. You give me your secret, I control everything. The multi-cluster SIG is actively, we actually have a talk, is active. We pretty much close to a solution that we're moving. We have a solution that move everybody off this path, that none of the clusters should have. Actually, not this path, but we provide a better way, not so that controller don't have to have the secret or the credentials for any of these clusters. So we have that solution. So that may solve at least relieve the security concern for this. So I don't know if I made it clear or if it gets worse.
Yeah, Ryan, could you link to that in this doc or in the proposal?
Sure.
Yeah, the point I was going to make here is that I agree, we have to be very careful with what we're asking this controller to do. If it is to read all inference pools and the services they link to, I don't think that is particularly sensitive. Where I think you start to get really sensitive when you start getting, secret access, right? Like if it's primarily read and primarily read on non-sensitive resources and then write to, I think, exclusively inference pool import, that seems reasonably well bounded. But we really, that feels like it would make sense to be part of the proposal, just as a sanity check. Like, what is it that we're asking this controller to do? What level of RBAC would it need in these clusters? I hope we can keep it bounded, but having that list as kind of a forcing function, where if we add a new requirement, we have to run back and say, oh wait, this requires the controller to also know secrets now, or to also know something else, then I think that becomes more problematic. Yeah, go ahead.
Shmuel?
Yeah, there's one other thing. It's a firewall thing. If the central guy is reading from the other guys, you have to open firewalls between them all over the place. You may want to look at what OCM did. They did the reverse. OCM, the open cluster management. So they push, actually, right? So all you have to do is you open the master cluster, and everybody else pushes stuff to it.
Right, and that's what I was thinking. So thanks for pointing that out. So like the latest iteration of the proposal, I tried to be more vague with importing and exporting controllers. And to Shmuel's point, what I was thinking was, like, instead of having this master controller that needs to be able to watch and pull information from each of the clusters, it was more of a kind of a pub sub, where an export controller could essentially publish the information from the export cluster, and other member clusters. The import controllers could be watching some external resource for updates and pull that information in. So with that said, Ryan, if you can look at the proposal, and if you see areas where maybe it is confusing, or we could provide better clarity there, that was kind of my intent with the latest iteration. Cool. I would like to kind of go back to the main point of this subtopic, though, and Rob, kind of where we're discussing spec versus status, right? So, again, if we're going to move forward with surfacing the list of clusters via status, so what do we do with observed generation, which is part of a status condition, right? Do we, instead of using the Meta V1 status conditions, do we create our own status condition that doesn't include observed generation? Unless I'm missing something. Observed generation is within a status condition, correct?
It is, but I think only the most advanced users actually pay attention to it. To be honest, maybe that's just my naive view of the world. But I think observed generation is inherently limited in these kind of multi-resource views of the world. We already have that problem in Gateway, where observed generation points to the observed generation of the gateway when there have potentially been hundreds of changes that affect the gateway but aren't on the gateway, right? So the routes change, more routes get attached, the backends change, all these other things, and we don't update the observed generation of the gateway because there's nothing's changed on the gateway itself. But it is kind of an inherent limitation of observed generation. I think we just kind of have to make the best of it. I don't think it's really I can't think of the observed generation we really want is some like, overarching generation of the broader config that includes multiple resources. And there's not really a way I know of to do that in Kube right now. And so, although that would be amazing to have, we don't. And I think not trying to solve it here is fine. I don't know. So in this case, that basically means that observed generation is probably always going to be one for the, because like I don't expect much else to change. Well, if we put something in spec, then something would change, but I don't buy the idea that anything in spec is really appropriate here. But I'm open to be convinced.
Yeah, again, it was just this observed generation that made me think twice, right? And
Yeah.
think that, okay, instead of adding the list of clusters and status, do it in spec. And maybe part of that cluster list is not just a cluster name, but some type of controller identifier for that cluster name. But again, I think maybe there's gray area. We kind of pivot back to starting off simple and iterating. So I'm not against sticking with the plan of just moving forward with the status. Keith?
I think I'm with Rob here. I think observed generation is just not a good fit for not even this multi-resource thing, but it's not a good fit for these controller-only resources just because the idea is that the status is representing the generation that the controller saw in the spec and then took some action, and that's just in the status. There's nothing this controller is saying. Like maybe it would be the generation of the inference pool that it saw in its local cluster, but again, like there's multiple clusters that the controller is looking at, and so I just feel like it's not a great fit for this particular use case.
Ryan?
So I thought about it a little bit more. One thing, I think the reason I brought this up in the beginning was really about freshness. Means, for example, if one of the clusters, so now we don't even have all the endpoints things. Previously, we have all these information. So say these information are stale. Somehow there's a network partition, firewall, whatever. Nobody knows from this API. Nobody knows. Even in the spec, it doesn't even matter because the spec, if it has clusters and that cluster gets partitioned out, your spec doesn't change. It still looks fresh, but it's actually not. That cluster is gone. Oh, there's a new cluster coming in. It's not reflected. So even putting into a spec wouldn't fundamentally really solve this problem either. I'm not entirely sure how to solve this. So it's not really just a spec thing.
Yeah, I agree. I wonder if, again, this feels like a novel concept. There's a SIG-Arch meeting in 20 minutes, I think. Maybe I'll ask there if anyone has ideas. But just spitballing here, just some idea of a timestamp like concept or freshness. Just in the idea of freshness, just a controller just every few hours or whatever, just bumping this and saying, hey, this is still up to date. This is still connected to the rest of the system. It hasn't gone stale. That seems like a useful concept to me. I don't really know how to represent that. There's not a lot of prior art for timestamps here, but I think, that may be the least bad I mean, least bad thing I can think of anyway. But
Yeah, Rob, I mean, it'd be a big help if you could discuss this with Sigart, see what we can do here, because I do think it could be an issue from a UX standpoint. And so, yeah, it's something that we gotta kind of figure out here. Next subtopic, I know this is, I imagine this was going to take a lot of the meeting to go through this, and I want to kind of move it along a little bit quicker to give an opportunity to address a couple of these other topics pretty quickly. But the last kind of subtopic here, I believe, within the proposal is this multi-implementation, multi-cluster inference pool. Let me pull it up here. Rob, this was something that you brought to.
Yeah, it was, I've spent a lot of my time looking at this, and probably all of us have spent a lot of time looking at this with the lens of how will I implement this API? And that is complicated enough. And then when you start to think about, hey, other people are going to implement this API, and they may be doing it at the same time in the same cluster as me, that gets very complicated, shall we say. Right now, what the way the spec or the way the proposal is stated is that it would be a meaningful shift if it, in the case where it's the same controller, and I know it very well could be different controllers here, but either way, each individual gateway controller is going to bring their own solution to this, even if it's a separate controller, and it to create, basically do the plumbing for multi-cluster inference pool. And what that means is creating inference pool imports in all the connected clusters. How on earth do we make that interoperable? There's one thing where we can just say, hey, listen, like there can only be one multi-cluster inference pool implementation per cluster, which kind of like is a way to just avoid the problem altogether by kicking the can down the road. But I don't know how we really enforce that. And the other is, to say, hey, everything has to work nicely with each other. And to do that, it requires you to basically have everyone who's managing inference pool upserts to inference pool imports to do upserts instead of just creations, and then have nested status everywhere. And then for garbage collection, I was thinking, well, maybe what you do is you add owner references, kind of abuse owner references to a point here. But that's a way of like when the gateway class goes away, so does the inference pool import. Well, when the final gateway class that's related to this goes away, so does the inference pool import. I don't know. It all feels pretty messy. I really don't. I'm not comfortable with the idea of saying that, hey, we can't have more than one here. So I think we kind of have to make a best effort for interoperability here. And I'm open to what people think about my idea of how this could work. I think there's probably some meaningful gaps or pain points here, but I don't have any better ideas either. So, yeah.
Oh, thanks, Rob. I was hoping that we'd be able to kind of dive into this subtopic a little bit more, but I know we're kind of running out of time, and you've used a lot of the call. Rob, I commented here, and I would just ask that others who have been involved in the proposal review and are interested, please dive into this particular subtopic and provide some input so we can try to figure out a path forward with this issue. All right. All right, I've got one other thing on the agenda, and Shmuel, I'll be quick so we can get to to your topic, and Shmuel, while I'm kind of going through mine really quick, if you can maybe just add a link to, I think it's either an issue, I think it's an issue you created or PR, so I could jump to that really quickly. Version of the quick start. So I know we have an issue that's been around for a long time with like version docs, right? So we can have multiple versions for a user that can have a drop down list and jump between versions. Well, that is not moving. I haven't been able to help the person out that was taking on that work, and I don't see anyone else maybe jumping in to help out. So we're in this state where we have a quick start guide that has some references to like a released bit, and then other references that are referencing information from master. And I got bit by it here just a couple of days ago, and I've been bit by it a few other times in the past. I know this has come up in discussion on Slack threads and so forth, and I just feel like we need to have quick start reflect the latest release until we support multi-release. And if we need some documentation related to how you work on master, or I'm sorry, on the main branch, that's typically developer focused. And if we need to, it's developer focused, and it probably wouldn't change nearly as much, right? To have that basically like in the docs repo. So Rob, I don't know who raised their hand first, Kellen, whoever.
It was Rob. Rob, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, +1. I feel like the solution here is some kind of branching strategy where, maybe before we, maybe most things for a new release go into a release branch, and main has, or maybe the opposite. Maybe we have a docs branch for release, and we changed our netlify config to always point at that. I don't know, but I agree. We want to be able to distinguish between, docs intended for a future release and docs intended for the current release. Yeah, so big +1. I don't know what that requires in terms of branching strategy, but open to whatever we can do to get there.
All right. Kellen?
I'm wondering if if the version docs is a bit of a ways off, if we just want to have latest stable release set version of quick start, and then what is considered main's quick start. Those would hopefully look the same right now, because I don't think there's much drift between main and V1. But in the future, as we're updating, we would update this quote unquote main quick start, and then just copy that over to the latest release when
Do
release
we
version.
do we actually want those both to be live on our website, or can we just have the main quick start be hidden in a branch, and what's live on our doc site is always just latest release?
I think we want it live. One of our closer partners, LMD, I believe they're pointing to our docs to get Inference Gateway going. And they're very much experimental tolerant. So they're going to want the latest and more experimental features. And I think we should keep that documented.
But I think to accomplish that, we need 422 to get resolved, and so that we can have multi-version docs.
I'm just suggesting that we do it rudimentarily and just have a tab that says, v1.x quick start, or make that the default, and then have a main or dev branch quick start guide.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it that way, where we are kind of using tabs for like gateway implementation. So maybe one approach is just having like 2 tabs, right? The main and then latest release, and you select one or the other. Man, my concern with that is like the maintenance, you know, and then I kind of go back to,
For sure.
I know there's a separate issue about actually pulling out docs. And so you see here where I comment, you know, another option is we strip out quick start and we just say quick start is like, hey, install the CRDs, and, you know, Kellen, to your point, we've got a tab for main, tab for next release or latest release. And then we say, hey, go to the implementations page and select an implementation to do the rest. And then it's up to the implementations. Obviously, you know, from a user experience, that could be a little more buggy and more complicated. So I don't know what's the better approach at this point.
I think Shmuel had their hand up.
Oh, Shmuel.
Yeah, I was going to say that I know other projects usually have a drop down where you select the version you want.
Right, that's where 422 is trying to get to here, Shmuel. So dive into that, and you'll see some of the issues that I think is it Art that was doing this. Yeah, there's just some issues that he had, and I don't know enough about like Kate's infrastructure and Netlify and stuff, and so I've kind of reached my point where I can't really help him anymore.
I was going to suggest that I know Coop Stellar, a project that I sort of a Kubernetes project I wasn't involved with it. I was actually a user of it for a while. They do this. They have version documentation. I don't know how they store it. Oh.
Yeah, there's a way to do it with make docs, and you know, I appreciate Art kicking it off here, but it's been, you know, we tried and failed in Gateway too. I don't really, you know, I think part of the problem is that none of the admins of the project on GitHub, at least on Gateway API, have admin on Netlify. So you need to, you know, loop in some other folks to try, but you know, it's harder when you're just trying to figure it out, right? Like if you knew what to ask them to do, then it would be one thing, but yeah, I'm not, obviously we should try. I think I understand why this kind of failed out. It's a hard problem to solve, unfortunately.
And the purpose of this right here is a stopgap measure, right? I mean, by no means is it meant to be long-term, but again, earlier this week when I ran into an issue and said, oh, geez, you know, some steps are using main or latest release, some step, and it's just like, we need to have at least one like list that a user can follow that is based on the latest release. But I mean, Kellen, to your point, like if there's a user, especially like LMD, that's like, hey, they need to be able to follow main. It's just from my standpoint that like that requires each step to be on main. So you go to an inference gateway, which right now, if you look at the quick start guide, K Gateway is essentially running on main, the steps there, because we haven't released a K Gateway release that includes support for inference pool v1. So, right, so in order to follow, you know, the inference gateway upstream steps, K Gateway needs to be running on main. And so, you know, it's like if we're going to have this kind of dual path, not only does the you know, the inference extension bits need to be off of main, but so do each of the inference gateway implementations potentially, because most likely, right, if we're saying, okay, install the latest CRDs, there's probably most of the gateway implementations aren't going to support that latest bits of that CRD, and you're going to have to run off of a main branch of that implementation. So anyways, I just wanted to highlight this. You know, I feel like we need to do something like immediately short term, because, you know, I think this just keeps coming up as an issue. Anyways, so please, if you can, jump into the this issue or pull request, whatever it is, and speak your mind. Shmuel.
Yeah. So this goes back to what we reported last week. Data parallel feature of VLM is very hot right now in LLMD land. They really want this. The way we think it should get supported is by simply having inference pool v1 with multiple target ports. So I've written most of the code. I think I've got it together. The problem is that Envoy doesn't get configured correctly. And what happens under the covers is, you can see from the configurations, I cut back on the configuration. I deleted all the junk that was the stuff that wasn't applicable to the issue. At least I think I did. I can get more if it helps anybody. Is that the Istio pilot takes the inference pool, and from the target ports, it creates a shadow service. Okay, the shadow service has as many ports as our target ports in inference pool. Okay, this causes two things to happen. One, it adds a cluster to the cluster definitions, one for every port on the shadow service. And then when it tries to create the route, because there's more than one port, it shoves in 80 instead of one of the ports from the clusters. So my simple question, I know we have everybody here, we have Daniel and Keith here. Do we really need all these clusters? Do they do anything? Or we just need the one cluster that the route mentions to make this work? Because a simple solution to the problem is when the shadow service is created, only to copy the first port, copy the first target port, and be done with. And the question is, what does that do? I don't understand enough to understand what that does to the system.
I think it depends on how, and I guess it's going to depend on Istio here, on how much you care about the validity of the endpoints returned by XProc, if you have any validation, or if you just blindly follow what XProc or EPP tells you. If you blindly follow what EPP tells you, the additional clusters or endpoints are only useful for fail open. But having a single port seems probably okay for fail open. So I think it really just comes down to the question that every implementation needs to answer for themselves of, are you going to blindly follow what EPP suggests, or are you going to add some kind of validation? If you do add some kind of validation, then you need Envoy to know every possible valid combination, every possible valid.
All the pods but Rob, all the pods aren't defined, right? So the EPP will definitely return addresses that Envoy doesn't know about.
Whoa. Why would it do that?
You have defined, there are 200 pods out there.
Yeah.
You haven't defined all those 200 addresses to Envoy.
Why wouldn't you? I mean, so usually, if it's a service, you get all the IP ports behind that service, all the pods matching that service, and shove them into.
So there is no service, right? These pods have no real service. It's a shadow service. It's not a real service.
Sure,
but it's a headless service. It might be a headless service, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No. I mean, I think my understanding is Istio does not validate what EPP returns and follows blindly. So in that case, I don't think you really need more than one cluster here. So your suggested shortcut or workaround seems fine to me. I do think there's, maybe we as a project should have some suggestion or guidance that blindly following endpoint picker has some risks associated with it. But for the time being, given the limited bit I know about Istio's implementation, I think your approach seems fine.
And Shmuel, I started looking into this. I thought I saw some conversion logic that was lacking to support the multiple ports. And then I stepped away from that, and I needed to focus on multi-cluster stuff, and I've been really focused on that for the last several days. So I will try to circle back around to it. In the meantime, you may want to tag Lior on this issue since he did most of the implementation for Istio.
Okay, I'll
And
find.
he may be able to expedite this.
Okay, I will tag him. Thank you.
Okay. And with that said, we are 2 minutes over. Let me just make sure that there's nothing else here. Cool. So thank you everyone for coming, and we will catch you online and hopefully at the next meeting. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thanks all.